On a bright, bustling morning, Aisha, a young woman in her late 20s, rushed through the crowded airport. She had just landed after a long international flight, and now she was running late for her connecting flight. She had just enough time to go through the security checks and make it to the boarding gate before the final call. Her heart raced with the thought of missing her flight. As she made her way to the security checkpoint, she noticed a large crowd of people gathered around. The line was moving slower than usual. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that she had been through airport security many times before and that she was prepared. But as she approached the officer standing near the checkpoint, things began to feel different. The officer, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, looked at her suspiciously. "Excuse me, ma'am," the officer said, his voice firm, "can I see your passport?" Aisha, a little surprised, immediately reached into her bag and handed him her passport. She tried to remain calm, as the officer flipped through the pages with a careful glance. She thought it was just another routine check. "You're in a hurry, aren't you?" the officer said, raising an eyebrow. Aisha nodded, smiling politely. "Yes, I'm just trying to make it to my next flight. It's very tight timing." The officer didn't respond with the same politeness. Instead, he seemed to scrutinize her more closely, staring at her passport for longer than usual. She could feel the tension in the air. It was clear that something wasn't right. "You're not from here," the officer said, finally looking up from the passport. His words weren't a question but a statement, and his tone felt accusatory. Aisha, sensing the tension growing, smiled gently. "No, I'm from out of the country. I've been traveling for work." The officer didn't smile back. Instead, he motioned for her to step aside. "I need to inspect your documents more thoroughly," he said. Aisha's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. The officer had done routine checks before, but this was different. His eyes seemed cold and suspicious, and Aisha couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He wasn't treating her the same way he had treated others in the line ahead of her. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, trying to stay calm. "Just follow me," the officer responded curtly, motioning for her to step behind the metal security booth. He didn't explain why she was being pulled aside, and he didn't ask for any additional documents. Aisha walked quietly behind the officer, trying to keep her anxiety in check. She was an experienced traveler and had seen her fair share of intense security checks, but nothing had ever felt like this before. She noticed that the officer kept glancing at her as she walked, and his eyes lingered a little too long on her face. "Please stand here," he said as he gestured to a small, empty corner near a security desk. Aisha stood there, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. The officer returned to his station and began to examine her passport once more. She was beginning to feel the weight of his gaze, the way his attention shifted from the document to her. It wasn't just the routine examination she had expected. "You're really in a hurry," the officer said again, this time with an edge to his voice. "What are you hiding?" Aisha was taken aback. "I'm not hiding anything," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. But the officer wasn't listening. His focus was now entirely on her passport, flipping the pages with exaggerated care. He paused on a particular page and then looked up at her, his eyes narrowing suspiciously. "This passport doesn't look right," he muttered under his breath. Aisha's heart started to race. She knew her passport was legitimate. She had used it countless times before without issue. But this officer seemed intent on finding something wrong. Before she could say anything, the officer grabbed the passport from her hands and ripped it in half, the sound of the paper tearing echoing through the quiet corner. Aisha's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the torn passport in his hands. "Hey! What are you doing?" she exclaimed, stepping forward. But the officer just looked at her coldly, as if he hadn't done anything wrong. He seemed to enjoy the power he had over her, the way he was able to make her feel small and insignificant in front of everyone. "This passport is fake," he said, a smug grin appearing on his face. "You're going to need to explain yourself to the authorities." Aisha couldn't believe what was happening. She stood there, frozen, trying to process what had just occurred. The officer had no right to destroy her passport like that. He hadn't asked for any proof or provided any reason for his actions. And now, she was left holding the pieces of her passport in her hands, as if the officer had somehow just invalidated her entire identity. "Please, I need to speak to your supervisor," Aisha said, trying to stay calm despite the rising anger inside her. The officer ignored her request, shaking his head. "No, you're not going anywhere. You're staying here until I get someone to investigate this. You've been lying to me this whole time, and I'm not letting you get away with it." Aisha's mind was racing. She knew she had to keep it together. She was far too calm, composed, and experienced to be shaken by the actions of one racist officer. But she also knew that the situation was escalating. This officer had just accused her of something that wasn't true, and now he was refusing to listen to reason. Taking a deep breath, Aisha tried to gather her thoughts. She wasn't just a regular traveler. She wasn't just some woman in an airport line. She had a powerful position, a secret identity, and the resources of one of the most powerful agencies in the country at her disposal. This officer had no idea who he was messing with. But before she could do anything else, the officer started to walk away, his back turned. He hadn't called for backup, nor had he made any move to address her request. He was just walking away as if nothing had happened. Aisha's grip on the torn pieces of her passport tightened. She wasn't going to let this go. This wasn't just about a torn passport. It was about something much bigger. And as she quietly gathered herself, the realization hit her: this officer's actions weren't just a personal attack on her, they were part of a much larger system that she had been working to expose for years. Little did the officer know, Aisha wasn't just an ordinary woman. She wasn't someone to be taken lightly. And his actions today would soon come back to haunt him in ways he never expected. As the officer walked away, leaving Aisha standing there with the pieces of her ripped passport, she felt a mixture of shock and disbelief. The situation had escalated so quickly, and yet, in that moment, she knew she had to stay calm. Aisha's mind raced as she processed what had just happened. How could this officer be so quick to judge her, to tear up her passport without even considering the possibility that it was legitimate? His actions weren't just a mistake, they were a reflection of something much deeper, something that had been building for years. Aisha's phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking her from her thoughts. She pulled it out and saw a message from her superior at the FBI. "Stay calm. We've got your back. But we need you to handle this carefully. No rash decisions. Keep your cover." The words were a reminder of who she really was, not just a traveler, but one of the top undercover agents in the FBI. Aisha had spent years working on sensitive cases, infiltrating dangerous networks, and tracking down criminals. She had learned to stay focused, even when the situation seemed overwhelming. And now, she knew that her training and experience would be put to the test. She wasn't just dealing with a racist cop, she was dealing with a system that allowed people like him to act with impunity. Her hands still trembling from the shock of the moment, Aisha gathered the torn pieces of her passport. She shoved them into her bag, determined to deal with this later. Her next move was clear: she needed to leave the airport and report the incident to the FBI, but doing so would raise questions, and she couldn't afford to blow her cover just yet. Her position as an undercover agent meant she couldn't afford to reveal too much to the authorities. If she did, the operation she had been working on for months could be compromised. Aisha walked out of the security area, her head held high, but inside, she was seething. The officer's words echoed in her mind: "This passport is fake. It wasn't just the accusation that bothered her, it was the way he had treated her. He had assumed that she was guilty based on nothing more than her appearance. It wasn't the first time she had encountered this kind of prejudice, but it was the first time it had happened so blatantly in front of so many people. As she made her way to the exit, she passed several officers who glanced at her with curiosity, but none of them stopped her. They didn't know who she really was, just another woman in an airport, going about her business. Aisha let out a slow breath, trying to calm her racing thoughts. She had to think strategically. Every move she made from here on out would matter. One mistake could expose everything. Once outside, she made her way to a quiet corner of the parking lot. She needed to get somewhere safe, somewhere she could regroup and contact the FBI without drawing attention. She pulled out her phone again and sent a quick message to her superior. Officer's name is Carlson. He's part of a much bigger system. I need backup. Can't expose myself just yet. The reply came almost immediately. Understood. Stay hidden. We'll handle it from here. Take care of yourself. We'll discuss the next steps soon. Aisha pocketed her phone and leaned against the car she had rented. The cold metal felt reassuring beneath her touch, grounding her in the present moment. She wasn't just a victim of a racist cop, she was an FBI agent. She was a part of something much bigger, something that could bring justice not only to her but to countless others who had been wronged by the system. But getting justice wouldn't be easy. Aisha knew that exposing the officer's corruption would require more than just reporting the incident. It would take time, effort, and the right approach. She had to find out more about this officer, Carlson. Why had he treated her this way? What was his connection to the corrupt systems she had been investigating for years? Aisha had a hunch that there was more to this officer's behavior than simple prejudice. She knew the importance of uncovering the truth, and now, she had a personal stake in it. Aisha didn't want to leave the airport just yet. She needed to figure out what had driven Carlson to act this way. She had worked undercover for too long to let something like this slide. Aisha had learned that people like him didn't just act on a whim, they were part of a larger network, a network that protected corrupt individuals, and that was something she could not allow to continue. She started walking back to the terminal, moving carefully and keeping an eye out for any signs of Carlson or anyone who might be connected to him. She had to be discreet, careful not to draw attention to herself. Her FBI training kicked in as she scanned her surroundings, noting every face and every movement. She was used to being vigilant, to blending in with the crowd, but today felt different. Today, she was more than just an agent. Today, she was a woman wronged, and she wouldn't rest until she got the justice she deserved. A few minutes later, Aisha found herself standing outside the security office, trying to figure out her next move. She knew she couldn't confront Carlson directly, not yet. He was just one small part of the larger issue at hand. But she needed to gather information. She needed to know what kind of man he was, what motivated him, and most importantly, what kind of corruption he was involved in. If she could take him down, it would open the door to uncovering a much larger network of criminal activity. Aisha took a deep breath and approached the officer behind the desk. He glanced up at her, his eyes narrowing as she approached. "Can I help you?" he asked. "I need to file a complaint," Aisha said calmly, trying to keep her voice steady. "About Officer Carlson. He tore up my passport, and I'd like to report it." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Tore up your passport? Are you sure about that?" "Yes," Aisha replied, her voice unwavering. "He accused me of having a fake passport, and when I tried to explain, he destroyed it. I want to know how to file an official report." The officer seemed to hesitate for a moment before responding. "I'll need to get his side of the story first. Please wait here." Aisha nodded, keeping her expression neutral. This was just the beginning. She knew that nothing would be straightforward in this process. But she also knew that she was on the right path. She had seen corruption firsthand, and she had made a vow to bring it to light. Today was no different. As she waited, Aisha reflected on the events that had unfolded. This wasn't just about getting revenge on a racist cop. This was about exposing a system that allowed people like Officer Carlson to thrive, unchecked and unpunished. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for the countless others who had been wronged by the same system. And no matter how long it took, Aisha was ready for the battle ahead. As Aisha waited in the quiet office of the airport security desk, her mind was racing. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had been through countless high-stakes operations, but this was different. This wasn't just another case, this was personal. Officer Carlson had crossed a line, and now, Aisha was determined to make him pay for his actions. She glanced around the office, her eyes scanning for any signs of movement. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly above, casting a harsh light on the room. She could hear the hum of the airport in the distance, the sounds of travelers rushing to and fro. But here, in this small corner of the airport, it was just Aisha and the officer behind the desk. A few moments passed before the officer returned, his face unreadable. "Officer Carlson will be here shortly," he said, his tone almost apologetic. "He's in a meeting, but he'll come and speak with you." Aisha nodded, not wanting to engage in small talk. She didn't care about the officer's excuses or why it had taken him so long to come back. Her only focus was on getting the justice she deserved. Carlson had ripped up her passport, humiliated her in front of others, and now he was going to answer for it. As she sat there, the anger that had initially sparked in her chest was replaced by something else, resolve. Aisha was no longer just a victim of one racist officer's actions. She was an agent of change, someone who could make a difference. The incident in the airport was not just a random event, it was a turning point, a moment that could change the course of her career and the future of the corrupt system she had spent years fighting against. Aisha had worked undercover for the FBI for years, infiltrating some of the most dangerous criminal organizations in the country. But this felt different. It wasn't just about exposing a few bad apples, it was about dismantling an entire network, a network of corruption that ran deep within law enforcement itself. And Officer Carlson was just one cog in the machine. Aisha's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. She looked up to see Officer Carlson walking toward her, his expression a mixture of irritation and defensiveness. He didn't look at her directly, but rather at the ground, avoiding eye contact. He seemed to know that he was in the wrong, but his pride wouldn't allow him to admit it. "You wanted to file a complaint." Carlson's voice was cold and dismissive. "I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't rip your passport. You're probably just making a big deal out of nothing." Aisha stood up slowly, her calm demeanor belying the fire that burned within her. "I know what happened," she said quietly, but firmly. "You tore up my passport, and I'm not going to let you get away with it." Carlson sneered. "And what exactly do you think you can do about it?" He crossed his arms, standing a little taller as if trying to assert his dominance. "You're just another woman who thinks she's above the law. You've got nothing." Aisha took a deep breath. She knew that getting into a shouting match with him wouldn't help. Instead, she needed to approach this strategically. "You don't know who I am, do you?" she asked calmly. Her voice held no trace of fear or anger, just a quiet, measured tone. Carlson raised an eyebrow. "What's that supposed to mean?" Aisha didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small piece of paper. She slid it across the desk toward him. "You're involved in something much bigger than you realize," she said softly. "I'm going to bring everything to light, starting with you." Carlson stared at the paper for a moment, his expression faltering. He picked it up, his eyes scanning the contents. His face paled as he read. The document was a list of names, dates, and details that tied him to a larger network of corruption within the police force, a network Aisha had been investigating for months. He had no idea that Aisha had been working undercover, gathering information that would bring down corrupt officers like him. For a moment, the officer seemed speechless. He didn't know what to say or how to respond. The power dynamic had shifted. Aisha had the upper hand now, and she wasn't going to back down. "You think this is a game?" Carlson said, his voice now filled with a mix of anger and fear. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. You're just a small-time agent who thinks she can change anything. I've got friends, people who'll protect me." Aisha's eyes narrowed. "I'm not playing games, officer. You've been part of a system that's broken, a system that has allowed people like you to thrive. But your time is up. You can either help me take down the network, or I'll expose everything. Your choice." Carlson stood there for a moment, his eyes darting around the room, as if he were trying to figure out if Aisha was bluffing. But deep down, he knew she wasn't. He knew that if he didn't comply, everything he had worked for, his connections, his power, his freedom, would come crashing down. Finally, he spoke again, his voice quieter now. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to confess," Aisha said, her voice steady and unwavering. "You're not just going to walk away from this. You're going to help me take down everyone involved in this mess, or I'll make sure you never wear that badge again." Carlson's face twisted in frustration. He knew he had no choice. He could either cooperate or face the consequences. The network he had been a part of was too big for him to fight alone, and Aisha had just shown him that she was a force he couldn't ignore. "I'll do it," he muttered reluctantly. "But you have to promise me one thing." "What's that?" Aisha asked, raising an eyebrow. "You have to protect me," Carlson said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If I'm going to testify, I need to know I'm safe. There are people who won't hesitate to silence me if I talk." Aisha nodded, her expression softening. "I'll make sure you're protected. But you have to be honest with me. No more lies." Carlson hesitated for a moment longer before nodding. "All right. I'll help you. But you have to promise me this doesn't end with me." "I promise," Aisha said, her voice firm. "But you're the first piece of the puzzle. And once we've taken down the network, there will be no going back." As Carlson left the room, Aisha let out a slow breath. The hard part was over. She had gotten him to admit his involvement in the corruption, but this was just the beginning. There were many more pieces to the puzzle, and Aisha was determined to uncover them all. She was in the fight for the long haul, and nothing was going to stop her now. Aisha sat in the small, dimly lit room, her thoughts running over the events that had led to this moment. She had done it. She had gotten Officer Carlson to cooperate. But as much as that felt like a victory, it was only the beginning. What came next was the hard part, the part where everything she had worked for in secret could come crashing down. There was no going back now. Carlson had agreed to cooperate, but Aisha knew better than to trust him completely. People like him, people who had spent years climbing the ladder of corruption, didn't suddenly turn into saints overnight. She'd seen it too many times in her line of work. Once you're tangled in a web of lies, it's hard to break free. But Carlson was scared. That much was clear. And fear could be a powerful motivator, especially when it came to saving one's own skin. Aisha picked up her phone and quickly sent a message to her superior at the FBI, "Carlson's in. He's scared, but he'll talk. We need a plan to protect him and move fast. I'm starting to connect the dots. It's bigger than I thought." The reply was swift, "Understood. We're on standby. Be careful. We'll handle security." Aisha put the phone down and leaned back in her chair. She felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her shoulders. The system she had spent years trying to uncover had a lot of moving parts, and Carlson was just one piece of it. But as she thought more about what he had confessed, a picture started to form, a picture that was much more complicated and dangerous than she had initially imagined. The officer had given her a few names. Names of people he trusted, people who were at the center of the corruption. These were high-ranking individuals who used their positions to protect criminal organizations, drug rings, and illegal businesses. What Carlson had been a part of was not just some petty corruption within the police force. It was a full-blown criminal network, one that had infiltrated the system at every level. Aisha's mind raced as she considered her next move. She needed to act fast, but she couldn't rush into anything without proper preparation. The network was vast, and if she made a wrong move, it could mean the end of her career or worse. She had seen it happen before, agents who had gotten too close to the truth, only to be silenced before they could expose anything. She couldn't let that happen. Not this time. She stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the busy street below. It was a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding inside her mind. The world outside seemed so normal, so calm, but Aisha knew better. She knew that the peace was just an illusion, one that was built on systems of power and corruption that people like Carlson had fed into for years. Her phone buzzed again, and she picked it up. It was a message from one of her trusted allies within the FBI. "We've located some of the other officers involved. We need to move quickly. Do you have a list of names?" Aisha quickly typed out a response, "Yes. Carlson gave me a few names. I'll send them over. But we need to be careful. These people have connections everywhere. If we move too quickly, we'll expose ourselves." She paused for a moment, thinking. The operation was risky, and it required precision. One wrong step could set everything back by months or even years. But Aisha was used to operating in high-stress environments. It was part of the job. The hard part, however, was learning to trust the right people and ensuring that those who were helping her weren't just going to turn on her when the stakes got too high. As she sent the list of names to her ally, Aisha reviewed the details she had gathered about the network. It wasn't just the officers Carlson had named. There were judges, business owners, and even politicians involved. This was a well-oiled machine, and Aisha knew she had to be careful. If she made any moves that were too obvious, it could lead to disaster. These people had power, and they wouldn't hesitate to destroy anyone who posed a threat to their operation. Aisha's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a knock on the door. She quickly wiped the concern from her face and opened it to find one of her fellow agents standing in the hallway. "We've got eyes on Carlson," the agent said in a low voice. "He's agreed to meet with the prosecutor. We've arranged a safe house for him. It's time to move forward." Aisha nodded. This was it. The moment of truth. "Let's go," she said. She grabbed her coat and followed the agent down the hallway, her mind still running through the possibilities. They needed to get Carlson to safety, but they also needed to move quickly to prevent any further leaks within the department. Aisha couldn't afford to waste any time. The network they were up against was too big, and they had to move fast before it collapsed under its own weight. As they drove to the safe house, Aisha couldn't help but think back to the airport. The way Carlson had torn up her passport had felt like a personal attack, but she knew it was more than that. It was a symbol of how those in power could destroy lives without a second thought. He had tried to break her, but he had only made her stronger. The experience had hardened her resolve. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been wronged by the system. They arrived at the safe house just as the sun was beginning to set. The house was small, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, far from the bustling streets of the city. It was perfect for what they needed, a place where Carlson could stay out of sight while they continued to build their case. Aisha and the agent quickly set up a perimeter, making sure that no one would be able to get close without being detected. They couldn't afford any surprises. Carlson arrived shortly after, looking nervous but relieved. His face was pale, and his hands trembled slightly as he stepped out of the car. Aisha couldn't help but notice the fear in his eyes. He had made the right choice by agreeing to cooperate, but it was clear that he was still scared. The people he had been working with were ruthless, and they wouldn't hesitate to eliminate him if they thought he was a liability. "Get some rest," Aisha told him as he entered the safe house. "We'll be in touch soon. We'll make sure you're protected." Carlson nodded silently and walked into the house, the door closing behind him with a soft thud. Aisha stood outside for a moment, staring at the house. This was only the beginning, and there was so much more to do. She knew the dangers that lay ahead, but she was ready for whatever came next. The wheels of justice were turning, and nothing was going to stop her now. Days passed, and Aisha couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The operation had gained momentum, but every move she made had to be calculated with precision. Carlson's cooperation had been the key to unlocking a much bigger network of corruption, and the deeper she dug, the more dangerous it became. But the wheels of justice were turning, and Aisha was determined to see this through, no matter the cost. The safe house was quiet, far from the chaos of the city. It had been a few days since Carlson had agreed to cooperate, and he was still holed up there, isolated from the world. Aisha checked in on him regularly, making sure he was comfortable and ensuring that no one was watching. But she knew that the real challenge was still ahead, exposing the people at the top of the network and making sure Carlson's testimony would hold up in court. Aisha sat in the small office she had set up, surrounded by files, documents, and photos. She had compiled everything she could find on the network, cross-referencing names, dates, and locations. There were connections everywhere: officers, politicians, and business people. It was a complex web of corruption that had spread throughout the system like a cancer. And now, Aisha had the chance to take it down. But the closer she got, the more dangerous things became. The people she was after had power, and power meant they could strike back if they felt threatened. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from her FBI superior: "We've got movement. One of the names you provided has been flagged. We need to act fast. Meet me at the safe house in 30 minutes. Aisha's heart raced. This was the break they'd been waiting for. The network was about to crack wide open. She quickly gathered her things and left the office, heading toward the safe house where Carlson was staying. As she drove, she thought about how far she had come. A few weeks ago, she had been just another agent working a routine case. Now, she was in the middle of something much bigger. The stakes had never been higher. When Aisha arrived at the safe house, she found her superior, Agent Ramirez, waiting for her in the living room. He looked serious, his brow furrowed as he stared at a laptop screen. Aisha walked over, her mind already racing. "What's happening?" she asked. "We've found a direct connection between one of the names Carlson gave us and a high-ranking politician," Ramirez said, his voice tense. "We've been tracking his movements, and it looks like he's planning something big. If we don't act fast, he could disappear, or worse." Aisha's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the moment they had been working toward. She leaned in, her eyes scanning the laptop screen. The name on the list was one she had seen before, but now it had taken on a new, terrifying significance. This wasn't just about taking down a few corrupt officers. This politician had the power to change the course of everything. If he was involved, the entire system could be at risk. "We need to move on this right now," Aisha said, her voice calm but urgent. "We can't let him slip away." Ramirez nodded, already dialing his phone. "I'm calling in backup. We'll need all hands on deck for this one." Aisha stepped back and took a deep breath. She knew this would be a risky operation, but she also knew that they couldn't afford to wait any longer. The network was too powerful, and every second counted. She quickly made a list of what they needed to do: gather evidence, secure the politician's location, and ensure Carlson's safety. But she also knew there was one thing they needed most of all: trust. Trust in each other, and trust that they could take down the corrupt system that had been allowed to thrive for so long. As Ramirez made the calls, Aisha couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come. She had started this journey as a young agent, eager to prove herself in the field. But over the years, she had grown stronger, wiser, and more determined. She had seen firsthand how deep the corruption ran, how it infected every part of the system. She had seen the power that people in positions of authority could wield, and how they would stop at nothing to protect their interests. But now, she had a chance to do something that could change everything. This wasn't just about taking down a few bad apples, it was about dismantling the entire system of corruption that had taken root over the years. Minutes later, backup arrived. Agents from the FBI and local law enforcement gathered in the living room, preparing for the operation. Aisha's mind was focused, her thoughts sharp. This was what she had trained for, what she had been working toward for years. The team was ready, and they had everything they needed to take down the network. All they needed now was the right moment. Aisha looked over at Carlson, who was sitting quietly in the corner of the room. He had been through a lot, and she could see the fear in his eyes. He knew that what they were about to do could change everything for him as well. But he had made the right choice in cooperating, and now it was time for him to face the consequences of his actions. "We're ready," Ramirez said, his voice steady. "Let's move out." The team piled into their cars and headed toward the politician's location. Aisha sat in the front seat, her mind racing through every possible scenario. This wasn't just a raid, it was the culmination of everything she had worked for. If they succeeded, they would take down the network and expose the corruption that had festered for years. But if they failed, everything could come crashing down. When they arrived at the politician's mansion, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Agents quickly surrounded the property, positioning themselves strategically to ensure there was no escape. Aisha took a deep breath as she stepped out of the car. This was it. There was no turning back now. The operation went smoothly at first. The team moved in quickly, securing the perimeter and entering the house without raising an alarm. But as they made their way through the mansion, Aisha couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The silence felt too heavy, too unnatural. She had been in enough high-stakes situations to know when things didn't feel right. And then it happened. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, followed by a door slamming shut. Aisha's heart raced as she turned to her team. "Move," she shouted. The agents rushed forward, but by the time they reached the room where the politician had been hiding, it was too late. The man was gone. Aisha stood in the doorway, staring at the empty room. Her mind was racing, but she knew that this wasn't the end. The politician had fled, but they still had the evidence they needed to bring down the rest of the network. It was a setback, but not a defeat. "We'll get him," Ramirez said, placing a hand on Aisha's shoulder. "This isn't over yet." Aisha nodded, her determination unwavering. This was just the beginning. The corrupt system wasn't going to give up easily, but she wasn't going to stop fighting until it was brought down. There was still work to be done, and Aisha was ready for whatever came next. This fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning.